Mangwana ni Mose vanuashe. Atamarie ite iwi unga atua. Mataka vinakave kemunikechi na tamata nikolo. Good morning to you all, God's people. A small multilingual greeting that may be a bit strange to some, but carries a lot of symbolism today. I just greeted you, first in my native language of Shona, then in Te Reo Maori, Fijian, and finally in English. So, good morning again, people of God. 2 weeks ago was Pentecost, the birthday of the Christian church, and a time when the disciples heard people speaking in many different languages. To some, it appeared as if the people speaking were drunk and babbling on in unintelligible languages. Peter, a respected leader among the disciples, spoke up and reminded the listeners that this plethora of different languages was a special gift, the Holy Spirit that Jesus had promised. Pouhere Sunday is the second Sunday after Pentecost, and a day in 1992 when our Anglican Church signed its constitution, or Te Pouhere. This document establishes the three tikanga, or cultural streams, of our church in this province of Aotearoa, New Zealand and Polynesia. Our three beautiful cultural strands are Tikanga Maori, Tikanga Pākehā, and Tikanga Pacifica. And I'll just keep that in there because I'll be referring to some of the wording in there. I just want to say thank you again to Me Aroa for wonderful, wonderful prayer. And again, a connection with our cultural heritage here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. The word Te Pouhere in Te Reo means a hitching post for waka or canoe. There's one post, Christ, with three waka tied up to it. Many of you will probably know that I'm a recent immigrant to these lands. When I was a little boy, I grew up hearing stories of apartheid South Africa. Apartheid was a government policy of racial segregation that deliberately kept certain groups of people apart. I must confess, when I first heard about the three tikanga approach, I was more than a little bit uncomfortable. Why on earth would the church in the 21st century adopt or promote such division? What I was exposed to and continue to learn were the valid and deeply respectful reasons why this three tikanga approach was taken. It was not a system akin to apartheid at all, but one deeply rooted in love, respect, and a desire to allow growth and cultural expression. The Anglican Church in New Zealand sought to bring unity and justice into the mainly three cultural groups, although we know we are a multicultural society. This actually brought empowerment and recognition to all cultural partners within the church. Please allow me to take you on a tiny historical journey. Christian missionaries from Europe arrived in Aotearoa in 1814. The Maori church started when Chief Ruatara introduced Samuel Mawson to his people at Ohi Beach in the Bay of Islands. The early church in New Zealand was in Te Reo Maori. The missionaries completely immersed themselves in the local language and culture. If you had come to visit, you would have found that everyone was speaking and worshipping in Te Reo Maori. Close to 30 years later, in 1842, the Pākehā Anglican Church started with the arrival of George Selwyn, who later on became the first bishop of the Anglican Church, Bishop George Selwyn. This key event was a couple of years after the signing of Te Tiriti o Waitangi. Coincidentally, Maori population and church attendance were greater than any other cultural group at this time. The differences in the way the early church was introduced to people of different backgrounds presented a need for a diverse and culturally respectful approach. There's a gospel story that appears in both Matthew and Luke about two builders. One built his house on the rock and the other one on sand. The two writers tell the same story, but from slightly different angles. In Matthew's version, the emphasis is placed on the troubles that come. The wind blows, the rain falls, and the floodwaters rise, which leads to the house falling. Matthew's focus is on the challenges and troubles. In Luke's version, his emphasis is on the digging of the foundations. The builder who built on the rock dug deep and made sure his foundations were secure. When Matthew wrote his version, the church was going through a time of persecution. Matthew's story was told in a way that raised awareness and ensured people could relate his view to their own challenges. Luke, on the other hand, was more concerned with sharing the message based on the history of Israel and their spiritual experience. The strength of the foundations was Luke's focus. What we learn today is the importance of context. Not only do we need to tell the gospel stories with the context and target community in mind, we also need to work and minister as a church with cultural and linguistic context in mind. Our country is founded on a bicultural treaty. This founding document has Pacific nations to also be aware of. When we tell the gospel stories, or indeed minister and share Christianity, this bicultural and Pacific lens has to be taken into account. When we truly live the gospel message, we have love at the center of all our dealings with other people. In my traditional Zimbabwean context, showing respect to elders calls for people to humble or physically lower themselves when meeting elders for the first time. In some Western settings, when respected people enter a room, all people are expected to rise. A small, minor example of the differences that exist between cultures. The 3 tikanga model allows equal partnership, but separate delivery and growth to ensure the unique differences in our cultural and linguistic diversity are allowed to be expressed. It is not about preserving our own worldview, but extending ourselves to accommodate, honor, and respect separate cultural expressions. I'm sure we're all aware of the conflicts that occurred when the 1840 treaty document was translated. The 2 recognized versions, one in Te Reo Maori and one in English, have different interpretations within them. These differences have taken generations to try and untangle, or dare I say, reach an agreement. The 3 tikanga model avoids the potential conflict areas by allowing self-expression through worship in the languages and cultural contexts that people are most comfortable in. The 3 waka are hitched to the same post, Jesus Christ, but allowed to paddle along to their individual rhythms, following songs, dress, and other culturally appropriate things. This prevents judgment or a need to constantly explain or justify things. In our church, we follow the same constitution, Book of Common Prayer, and read the same Bible, albeit in our different languages. As highlighted in the gospel story told by Matthew and Luke, there will always be slightly different viewpoints and approaches. Te Pouhere celebrates our diversity. It also honors all the cultural groups as equals and allows the continued respectful journey that brings us closer together rather than pushes us apart. Without it, we would have caused more offense and left people out of our wonderful church, as some would have felt excluded and not appreciated. There is nothing greater and more empowering than hearing and worshipping in one's own native language. The story of Pentecost further reminds us of this. Speaking in multiple languages was a great gift of the Holy Spirit. How blessed we are in the Anglican Church in Aotearoa, New Zealand and Polynesia. We honour and respect our multicultural links, giving them equal respect and treatment. The golden thread that binds us together within our church is love. In our gospel reading today, Jesus says this, "And I gave you this work to go and produce fruit, fruit that will last. Then the Father will give you anything you ask for in my name. This is my command, love one another." Just as we heard from the Pentecost message, all the people who were gathered on that day heard everyone speaking in many different languages. Looking at the history of the church here in New Zealand, we find that if we have too much unity, it flattens our diversity. However, if we aim for too much diversity, then we lose our unity. The trick is to find the right balance. Te Pouhere is the best way of honouring our diverse backgrounds whilst working together as one church. But having it on paper is not enough. I pray that we all continue to celebrate our diversity, yet keep the balance that promotes our unity. Ratapu Pouhere Hari. Singatabu ni matuvavale mamaru. Happy Pouhere Sunday. Amen.